this guy named John W Bryant, and he's currently the prophet of the Gnostic Temple of the Pearl. Joined the LDS Church, served a mission in Japan, and then after his mission, he decided to join the Apostolic United Brethren. He started receiving visions. First, John the Beloved appeared to him, and then Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, John Taylor, and other fundamentalist leaders. And then he said that he was taken to the city of Enoch in a vision. And while he was there, he received the second anointing. He was called to be the one mighty and strong. And he was sealed.
Have you ever looked at the Wikipedia page that has like the list of all the mighty and strong?
There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
And in addition, he was actually sealed to Joseph Smith in this city of Enoch vision. They kind of transitioned a bit and moved to Las Vegas, where they had a ranch. It's kind of like a hippie free love commune, in the 70s is what I picture. And they changed the name to the Evangelical Church of Christ. More feminist, less patriarchal. And one of the things that happened is that he says that he met one of the wives of one of the three Nephites. Okay. And the wife of the three Nephite ordained him to the higher light of Christ through a sexual ordination. And then he...
like Tantra, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then he was given the charge to then pass that along to all of his followers. And so he implemented a system of sealings. Of course, there were sealings for eternity, but there were also sealings that could be for a month or even for one day, and so that's kind of an interesting concept.
Which is funny because that's like what supposedly the BYU students were doing, going down to
going to
Las Vegas. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome to Mystics and Muons. I've got Mike, and you'll have to pronounce your name again for me.
LeCheminant.
Okay,
Mike
so we both have French last names that we've had to explain to people throughout our lives. Yours is probably a little easier to get than mine. And I guess I'll introduce for people listening. So I rebranded from Mormons, Mystics, and Muons just to Mystics and Muons, somewhat to take a little less of an emphasis on Mormonism and more science and spirituality taking the primary focus, because I'm most interested in that. And I think that's where I can maybe have more contributions, but also I think this creation, this podcast is like reflects my personal journey too, which I never really got stuck in, like the toxic ex-Mormon. I think it's a helpful phase, but it can get toxic if you just get stuck there. And I've kind of pared back my ex-Mormon Reddit. Haven't listened to Mormon stories in a while, and kind of find a balance of like seeing and respecting that that's like a healthy place for people to like get and connect with feelings that maybe they've shut down for a while. But I felt myself kind of getting drawn in a bit too much in this like duality. I feel like it's a bit sort of like you switch teams. And so you think you're on the right team now, but really the goal is to like quit the game. So this is, even though it's now Mystics and Muons. I still do want to focus on Mormonism at times, recontextualizing it, and kind of do it in a healthier way. And so, yeah, that's why Mike is on today. So, yeah, I'm trying to think of how I think I was on the Mormonism and Western Esotericism Facebook group, and somebody had posted, I don't know if it was, are you in that group?
I'm not.
Okay. It's an interesting group. But I think somebody had posted your video and I watched it, and I thought it was super fascinating. It was about Gnostic sects. And so then we emailed a bit, and then I kind of looped back, and yeah, here we are. So why don't you introduce yourself a bit?
Yeah. So, well, just to let you know, I'm 50 years old. I left the church 8 years ago, and it was a long, slow faith crisis, faith journey. Um, I've always been interested in apologetics, and so I was actually part of FAIR for
Oh,
a
interesting.
number of years. Yeah. Um,
That seems to be
when
kind
I
of a common journey
yeah,
that more,
yeah,
because there's Backyard Professor, which I haven't talked to him. I think it was part
yeah,
of FAIR.
he was
Um,
in Bill Reel.
okay, Bill Real. Stephen Fleming, I'd like to have him on the show at some point. I don't know if you've seen any of his work. He's still an active member. He just
Okay.
was a bishop for a while, but he was part of FAIR. But he's writing a book and did his thesis on like Platonism, Neoplatonism, and Mormonism. And so he's got kind of a blend of a lot of these ideas. So he's not, I guess, doesn't fit that bill, but a lot of people, yeah, seem to
Right.
transition their beliefs
That's very
through
true.
something like that.
Yeah. I first got involved because I thought it would be more of the anti-evangelical or, the evangelical anti-Mormon type of apologetics. And, once I got more involved, I realized, um, the questions and concerns were really coming from members of the church, you know,
Hmm.
struggling to stay in the church. And so, I wanted to be able to help these people stay in the church. So that that drew me into Mormon stories. Listening to John DeLynn and attending the Mormon History Association conference, and getting into biblical studies, and so it ended up leading to a faith crisis, but I kind of pushed through and decided to stay in the church at that point. I kind of felt like hey, I got through a faith crisis and I came out, with the testimony so I can help other people do the same thing. So FAIR kind of put together a small group, including Bill Reel and some others and me, um, to be more of a compassionate approach to people looking for help, with their questions. But in the end, the nail in the coffin for me was Joseph Smith's polygamy.
Hmm.
I was reading Brian Hale's 3-volume series on Joseph Smith's polygamy, and by the end of it, it just hit me that I couldn't believe it. So um,
So I have some questions
yeah,
about FAIR. First of
yeah,
all, my my journey, interesting enough, I was super logical. I like thought I had all the answers. Yeah, like I was into the apologetic stuff because I was looking for like I needed to like know the answers myself. Um, but I never allowed myself to approach the question with real intent. Like I always, this is the answer I need to come to, is that the church was
yeah,
true. How do I get to that point? And it, finally, caused a lot of difficulty just because I was so strict in black and white. Um, that's a very unhealthy way to practice Mormonism.
yeah,
Lot of difficulty in my marriage, because she had a much more healthier kind of gray view, much more intuitive. And so it, like Pandora's box is when you, for me, it was when I finally was like, okay, I don't have to come to any specific answer. I'm actually just going to search for truth. I read the CES letter. I was like, I pretty much know all this stuff. The Kinderhook plates were the only thing I didn't know. Wasn't that impressed with that. Then I read Fair LDS's response, and I was like, okay, that was much more like faith destroying than the CS letter for me, because for me, and psychology and like Jungian psychology, that's how I view things. And it seems, this is my perception of I'd like your thoughts from the inside. It seems that there's a lot of like repressed, or there's a lot of feelings that are getting packed down with some of these apologists, and it comes out very dogmatically in these attacks. I was listening to, are you familiar with the whole Beavis and Butthead?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it's very interesting, some of the stuff that comes out, and I don't know, like there's some drama with, I guess, Brian Hales and, the Michelle's podcast or whatever recently. I just hear about these things, what are your thoughts on, I guess, the mental health of the apologetic endeavor?
Yeah.
And what people's motivations are? How much is it to help people, and how much of it is like to keep shit together for themselves, which is a real thing.
Well, I think everyone drawn to it has their own doubts, and they're trying to convince themselves, that they're right. But I will say I was impressed with a lot of the people knew a lot of stuff, and a lot more than I did, So I kind of looked up to these people in Fair. I would have doubts, but if these people who are smarter than me, who know more than me, if they still have a testimony, then it's got to be my fault that I just haven't learned enough yet, and so once I learn what they know, then it's all going to make sense,
Yeah.
But it finally just got to a point that, it literally happened, one day, like just all at once. I knew that Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet. That was my conclusion at that point, that the DNC 132 was false, and so therefore he was a fallen prophet. So then it became my goal to kind of go back in time and determine exactly when it was that he fell, And so I really delved into the Doctrine and Covenants, studying a bunch of commentaries, all written by active church members. Think, well, maybe it was he was a prophet in Kirtland, but not Nauvoo, or, but in my mind, the more I looked at the revelations in the DNC with an open mind, there were just so many times where he was doing things, with the result benefiting him, asking people for money, asking people to do something for him. So, that kind of complicated my view of Joseph Smith.
It's so funny because in the Doctrine and Covenants, it talks of it's a very real possibility that Joseph Smith would fall as a prophet. It's like, if you don't do if you don't follow these things, you're gonna be removed. But then we completely take that out of the picture in Mormonism of like, okay, well, he could have fallen, but then Wilford Woodruff said this one thing that a prophet would lead the church astray. But that would be like me arguing with you and saying like, I will never tell you a lie. And then I just like say some outrageous thing. And then you're like, no, I told you at the beginning of this argument, I would never tell you a lie. So I cannot be lying right now. So like the very question of whether a prophet could lead the church astray, if that's not true, then Wilford Woodruff would have been, could have been leading the church astray there. Or like Joseph Smith and this is the thing that's like really broken my mind lately is, in the church, we put a lot of emphasis on these like spiritual confirmations. And it's, for me, for some people, it's really intense. For me, it was like, you felt peaceful, I felt like it was bringing me good fruits in my life. And then we trust that. I was like, well, I guess that's the fruits of the Spirit. But I don't know what section of the Doctrine and Covenants is, but there's a whole section where he's saying like, hey, you basically can't trust what you feel. You can't trust what the angel in front of you is saying. The only way you can know whether this is an angel from God or from Satan is by like doing this little rigmarole song and dance where you shake their hands. And if they do this and this. And so to me, like that really shows that he himself struggled with trying to figure out like, is this divine? Is this, from Satan?
Mm-hmm.
He viewed things from this polarity of like God and Satan, and being in a community, going through like a bizarre, very ungrounding Kundalini awakening that I had no concept of what that was, and seeing other people going through these, very ungrounded things, whether it's from psychedelics or something else. This is something that you really struggle with, where like you see these synchronicities, you see like you're getting messages and you're like, oh my gosh, I need to sell my house. I need to do this and that. And so it becomes very difficult and very uncomfortable to be like, I don't know, I followed the message last time and it like ended up with this. And so, but that there, like the fact that you can't know, you can't trust by what they're saying, you can't trust, you can have the most magnificent feelings and you still can't trust that. You have to trust a handshake. But like, did he shake God's hand? Did he shake Jesus' hand? Did he shake Moroni's hand? Like the whole story, like there's these logical things that like you really need to question everything.
Yeah,
Anyway,
you're right.
Side tangent.
Yeah, and as a member of the church, I was so focused on trying to be worthy so I could be in tune with the Spirit, so the Spirit could guide me and direct me. But that I realized how much fear I had. My life was just built around fear of unworthiness, of letting the wrong thing enter my mind that might cause me to lose my testimony, and then I'd lose the Spirit, and so forth and so on. So actually, another part of my journey was that at the same time I was going through this faith crisis, I was also in a very bad marriage and going through a divorce. And I ended up falling in love with another woman while I was going through a divorce. And that led me to being excommunicated. And, I actually kind of used it as a bit of an experiment. I thought, okay, I'm excommunicated. That means, I'm losing the Spirit, losing the priesthood. But you know what? All of a sudden, I felt closer to the Spirit. I felt closer to God. I felt more humble, more loving, and that was kind of that kind of made me realize even more of that, because at that point I was actually still open to rejoining the church, but as time went on, I realized I was actually better off outside of the church. um, I remained a Christian. I attended a Methodist church for a number of years. Currently, my religious beliefs are very nuanced, you could say. I am drawn toward Community of Christ. I'm a fan of John Hamer, if you're familiar with him. But I don't believe in the supernatural aspects of Christianity, but I look at all religions, and I'm open to the more mythical or mystical aspects of of religion and just studying religion in general.
Yeah, I think, I really relate to what sounds like a messy process, and that I had left Mormonism 8 years ago, but I was just like, I don't know what to believe. But my like deconstruction of like the consciousness and reality, and experiencing like endogenous, like no substances, like mystical experiences, and coming from somebody who is super logical, like had very, I was never giving testimonies about like hearing voices or whatnot, like very, very low level of spiritual experiences. But so that all happened in the midst of, divorce and getting into therapy, and kind of all, kind of crescendos at a point. But the same thing, I kind of floated around agnosticism, but it wasn't until I was like, all right, I'm going to give up on any hope that there's a God. I'm going to be an atheist. I'm going to follow this Sam Harris person, who is an atheist. I think the term atheism and theism is pretty kind of fraught. And so like, it was when I let go of everything and went in the exact opposite direction that like started meditating. I was like, oh yeah, I mean, I believe in God. It's just the whole universe. It's just all perspectives combined. It's all of us. That's the only thing that's omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent. But I think a lot of people find that it's when you finally kind of go in the opposite direction, or you experiment in the opposite direction. And then when you have like the same spirit that you felt in the church, but like even greater, all the fruits of the spirit, maybe like for me, it was like orders of magnitude greater, sometimes associated with like, things so antithetical to, like some of the most spiritual experiences that I had have been at like a festival with like, the publicans and the sinners, the places that I was always taught, like, this is where like Satan's going to get you. And those are like the most Christ-like people that I found. And so I think, the Alma 32 is experimenting on the word. Like it's actually, you kind of have to experiment in all different directions for yourself, and not just trust that, okay, this person, it worked for them, I'm just going to keep doing that.
Yeah, that's profound. That is similar to my experience. For a while, I would say I would call myself a deist. I believe that there is a God who created the world, but he doesn't, interact with humans. He doesn't uh, perform any miracles.
Mm-hmm.
But then there was one particular day I was walking down the street, walking my dog, and it just hit me that everything around me is a miracle. If you really think about it. I mean, the trees, the flowers, the birds, I mean, the dog I'm walking, if there is a miracle, it's these things here, it's nature.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I thought to myself, well, you know, if what is God? Well, maybe one definition of God would be, the essence of life, of the miracle of life. Um, I, it just kind of hit me that, what, I've been wondering if there's a God or not, and God is right in front of my face,
Mm-hmm.
everywhere around me, everywhere I look.
Mm-hmm.
That's God. You and me, and and not
Yeah.
only living things, but the entire world, the entire universe.
Yeah. And I think, it's so, you know, post Mormonism, ex Mormonism is very focused on like deconstructing this, deconstructing that. But they really don't go far enough, I think. Like you have to deconstruct like the whole idea of your ego, that you're a separate individual, that you have free will. Like you have to deconstruct language, this very idea that like what I say when I say God and you say when you say God, like Jacob Hansen, and like you realize these are things that I had never thought about. And so they're just not on your awareness, but they're actually pretty easy to like just watch some YouTube videos and just realize how much all these things are myths, and not myths in the way that they're not useful, but they're just like ways of us describing something infinite with like very finite terminology. And the very idea of these hard boundaries that like we figured science out, that we figured like that we have free will, or that we're separate. When you question those, when you deconstruct those, like, yeah, you enter a whole new playground where like the question isn't whether there's a God or not. You just see that as kind of like a silly,
right.
I mean, it's like your kids believing in, that babies come from, mommy and daddy hugging each other. It's like, it's not false, but you're not going to like give them all the details. It's useful for them. But even then, if you tried to give them what you thought were all the details, even that would just be a myth. It's not actually what's happening on maybe the cellular or like the subatomic level. Like all layers of us describing stuff are all myth, and they're useful, but you like learn the limits of it. And so, yeah, I had similar thoughts of, even though I didn't believe anything, I could look back now and see like, oh yeah, I remember I started thinking about like, well, I guess I'm just made of like atoms, and like the atoms will go back into the earth, and those will be like taken up into other people's bodies. And so I'll continue to exist, or I exist in the minds of like my kids. And so like once I'm dead, I will actually still continue to exist. Or like maybe it's all a tree and we're like the leaves of the tree, and then like we'll fall off, but like the tree will keep growing. So I had all these things that like I recognize like as intuition or like downloads or something, even though I wasn't looking, that now I can see like, oh yeah, it was me opening up to something.
Yeah, another analogy that comes to mind is waves on the ocean. The waves are part of the ocean, but they're also, separate for a period of time, and then they go back into the ocean. And that makes sense to me. I've heard you talk previously about pantheism, and that's what this would be defined as, that the entire universe is God. And to
And it
me,
makes like all of,
mm-hmm.
I was just gonna say, it makes all of like the stuff that Christ taught actually so much more meaningful. It's not like, oh, it's a good idea to treat other people like they're yourself, or like, when I was hungered or like naked, you like fed and clothed me. And they're like, no, we didn't do that to you. And he's like, oh, actually, when you saw other people, you did. Like it actually takes those out of like feel good sayings or ideas to like, no, that's actually the literal truth if you understand consciousness, and if you explore kind of Buddhism, Hinduism, non-duality more.
Yeah.
It's a tricky, I think I'm curious about this God and Satan thing, this love and fear. That I think is what's very difficult for people to reconcile, is that they like, a lot of people swing out and they're like, yeah, the Bible is not true. I don't believe Jesus, because they think they have to believe it literally. Yeah, so like the Bible didn't really mean too much to me. And it's interesting that like now going back, having a more mystical, esoteric view on things, I find a lot more meaning. I don't take a stance on whether Jesus actually like was resurrected or not. You can have some weird possibilities of like, there are people that are able to meditate and like put their bodies in a state of unconsciousness for like days. And so like some people talk about that, other people talk about, from a very philosophical, idealistic view where reality is more like a dream rather than what we think of like a deterministic mechanical world. Ceremonial magic and all this stuff makes a lot more sense. And so, somebody else talked about, like these magicians came and resurrected Jesus. I don't know, like it doesn't actually matter. I think there's meaning, but the idea, like the question of Jesus as a savior, redeeming us from sins and redeeming us from death is interesting because that is a very fear-based thing that is on the assumption that death is the end without Jesus, and that like there is like this Satan, this sin to fear. And so I think that's a hard switch for people to like let go of the idea of this duality of God versus Satan and find another way to recontextualize evil, because that shifts Christ from being a savior to Christ being just an archetype that we all actually have to become, like that we actually have to experience the atonement or like a mystical experience of being at one, whether it's like a, not necessarily a thing, but just that experience of being, and that like he didn't overcome death for us, but he just shows that like death actually isn't, it's an illusion. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Because that'll play into like when we talk about Gnosticism, that seems to be these Gnostics breakoffs.
So I mean, to me, the idea of Jesus's resurrection doesn't make logical sense. I don't think I believe that, but I love the idea of rebirth. That our lives can be reborn. Every day or anytime we maybe get off the correct path, we can have a new life, so to speak. So I like that idea. Also, the idea of theosis, that's something that I always liked about Mormonism with the King Follett discourse, that we can become gods. But now I realize not only can we become gods, we are gods. And it's just a matter of recognizing that, realizing it. That doesn't mean we have the ability to just do whatever we want or have all power or whatever, but we should treat each other as if they're gods, just like we are, and we're all connected. We're all one. We're all part of the universe. So that just resonates with me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I've talked about this in other episodes, but like there really is, just like you can look at your kids and see that there's two ways you can look at them. And I think this is interesting because this comes up in these, really tragic cases of like Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell and stuff, my kids are doing these things, or like Ruby Frankie, my kids are doing these things because they're evil. They're being possessed by, they're giving in to Satan and temptations, or just my kids are doing these things so they're learning to regulate their nervous system. And maybe they're having a hard time because, we've got this chaotic home environment. And so you can see the same thing, and you can either fit it to this like simplistic good and evil myth, or you can do a little more work, and it requires some self-compassion too, because we usually view ourselves as doing things because we're evil. And you can explain the same thing without needing to evoke a Satan. I think it's the same thing with like in therapy. A lot of people, like, you unpack all this stuff from childhood. Some people get into this stage of like, oh yeah, my dad's a narcissist, my mom's a narcissist, this and this, like you go through this phase of like you blaming your parents on everything on your parents. But then like you break through that and like, oh, and then they that actually just comes from shame, and that comes from their childhood, and like they just have these wounds, and like they actually none of those things were motivated by like these ill intent. They all came as these perfect babies that were picked up the patterns from there. But I think that's difficult to, especially with Mormonism, and especially around sexual purity. The morality thing is, you have this such a hard dichotomy where on the one side, sexual intimacy is theosis, it's exaltation, like it's the most divine thing that you can do, is to like, join together, have, eternal increase. And then on the other hand, if the government says a different thing and you're not married, legally, it's all this legal stuff, then this is like the sin next to murder. And so I think that's plays into to polygamy. So tell me about your interest in, where you went from there.
Yeah. So, I've always been interested in studying various denominations. For example, first of all, Christian denominations fascinate me. There was a year where we had our ward met in the afternoon, and so I decided to visit other churches in the mornings, on Sunday mornings, just as an academic exercise, and that was fascinating. I visited about 25 different churches, starting with the ones that were founded first, Catholic, Orthodox, Episcopal, Lutheran, so forth, Mennonite, Quaker, and kind of, going down to more recent denominations. So that was one thing that made me realize that the LDS Church didn't have the corner on goodness or, Christianity. Christianity was, a wide variety of different types of Christianity. And honestly, I felt the spirit in many of these other churches as much or more than I did in the LDS Church. So that was another kind of chink in the in the armor, so to speak. But then I started looking into all of the Mormon, breakoff groups, and that became really interesting. It started when I just Googled Community of Christ, and this was back around 2004 that I started researching this, and that led me to learning about the Strangites. James Strang, who he found brass plates buried in the ground. He had witnesses. He had visions and revelations, and brought forth new scripture, and sounded very familiar, And then,
With
yeah.
with the Strangites, I saw so you've read Robert Beckstead's paper, like the entheogenic. So he's got his paper, and then they have the journal article that they wrote together with like Bryce
Oh,
Blankenagel and
Bryce
Cody.
Blankenagel, yes.
Yeah. So have you read that paper?
I've heard Bryce talk several times about it. I don't
Okay.
think I've
So
read the paper, but
in one of the two papers, because like Robert Beckstead wrote his own paper, I think, and maybe presented at Sunstone or something, or maybe I think it was maybe 2007-ish. So he wrote a paper, and I actually like that a little more because it goes a little more mystical and esoteric, a little more spiritual. The paper that they had published in, I forget what journal, I think some journal of psychedelics, is more academic, and is also good. One of them talked about the Strangites, that James Strang used psychedelics. But I couldn't find, like Googling this morning, I couldn't find any specific sources for that, but I didn't look too hard. Do you
I
know anything about
I
this?
hadn't heard anything about that. I've read a couple of his biographies, but I haven't read that. I wouldn't be surprised. It does seem like, for example, with Joseph Smith and the Kirtland Temple dedication, it seems likely that there were entheogens of some kind placed in
Mm-hmm.
the sacramental wine. And of course, they weren't taking just little cups of wine. They were really drinking it. But that does seem to be what led to the endowment of power, so to speak, that they
Mm-hmm.
were looking for. Um,
Do you know of in any of these groups? Have you found that psychedelics were played a role that you know of, or does it seem to be more endogenous
no,
experiences?
the closest connection I found is there's the Native American Church, which uses peyote
Mm.
as their sacrament. Um,
And this is a
there's a
specific. This
So
is
it's
not
called the
referring to
Native
like.
American.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called the Native American Church. And one of the founders was a former RLDS member, interestingly.
Okay.
Um, and there was a break off from that church. It's called the Peyote Way Church of God, and it's in Arizona. And interestingly, if you look at their website, it talks about Joseph Smith and Mormonism, and it uses DNC Section 89, the Word of Wisdom, as part
Oh,
of their, I guess, scripture, part of their foundation for why they use peyote. So
because it does say in
that's,
there that
yeah,
these things are to be used for like the gladdening of your hearts and to be used
yes,
in, you know, in moderation. Like you could definitely get how
yeah.
entheogenic use from
So
maybe
there's
that.
a bit of a Mormon connection there. But I'm not familiar with any evidence that Mormon groups were directly using entheogens. It might be. My mind goes to the first vision in the sacred grove. When Joseph says that he woke up on his back, and seems like he was in an altered state of consciousness
Mm-hmm.
based on that. Bryce Blankenagel, interestingly, he walked through the sacred grove and took pictures and found mushrooms, the psilocybin
I
mushrooms,
think it
just growing
was
there.
it Amanita muscaria? Was it the red ones?
I think red and white. I think
Okay, so
I'm
yeah, those
not an
don't.
expert on that.
Yeah,
I don't know.
those are used. They don't have psilocybin, but they have muscimol and ibotenic acid, which are both different types of psychedelic. And there is an experience by, I forget this guy's name, after taking Amanita muscaria, and it's very similar to the first vision, where he saw God or something and had all this joy filled with love and whatnot. So I think yeah. I'm not sure if, I don't know whether or not any psilocybin containing mushrooms are in New York, but Amanita muscaria definitely
Yeah, that's
would be,
probably
and
what it
that
was.
is, it's different, but there's a lot of different ways that you could get in these places, and yeah, I think the emphasis not so much on the car that took you there, but like the destination
Right.
is better because you can see like looking at the commonalities, these groups that you looked at, probably a lot of them weren't, maybe most or all of them weren't using exogenous substances,
Right.
but different ways can trigger the same type of experiences.
Yeah. So I know the way you found out about me is because I posted something on YouTube that was my a presentation I gave at the John Whitmer Historical Association a few years
Mm-hmm.
ago, and so part of that is related to this guy named John W Bryant, and he's currently the prophet of the Gnostic Temple of the Pearl. And so, if it's okay, I'll
Mm-hmm.
just
Yeah,
tell you a little bit about the history of him.
yeah.
Um, so, in the 70s, he He grew up in New Hampshire. He found a copy of the Book of Mormon in the public library, joined the LDS Church, served a mission in Japan. Actually, this was probably in the late 60s when he converted. Um, and then after his mission, he decided to join the Apostolic United Brethren, the Mormon fundamentalist polygamist group. And he started receiving visions. First, John the Beloved appeared to him, and then Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, John Taylor, and other fundamentalist leaders. So he had these visions, visitations, and then he said that he was taken to the city of Enoch in a vision. And while he was there, he received the second anointing. He was called to be the one mighty and strong, and he was
Have you ever
sealed.
looked at the
Yeah,
Have you ever looked at the Wikipedia page that has like the list of all the mighty and
there's a lot of
strong?
them. There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
And in addition, he was actually sealed to Joseph Smith in this city of Enoch vision. Well, Rulon Allred, the prophet of the AUB, he was kind of leery about all this. So, they ended up parting ways. And so John W. Bryant started his own church called the Church of Christ Patriarchal. And he started receiving additional scriptures, translating scriptures, just to give you the names of some of these books, a dozen or so books that he wrote or translated, basically through Revelation, he said. But it's like the book of the generations of Adam, the book of the order of Elijah, writings of Abraham, ascension of Isaiah. So a lot of these were Old Testament type of. He would take Old Testament characters and then kind of expand on their stories and create additional
Fan fiction.
fan fiction, additional characters, storylines, book of the
Have you read
secrets of
any of
the
them?
ancients. What's that?
Have you read any of them?
Yeah, I read all of them, but it was a few years ago. I don't have it all memorized, but it was pretty interesting. I would say similar to the Book of Moses and Book of Abraham. It didn't have quite the narrative storyline as the Book of Mormon. It wasn't quite as interesting as the Book of Mormon, I would say, but it was about 1,000 pages that he translated. Some of them were published. I actually have, there's a book here called Sacred Scripture, and so that some of them are in there. But
did you ever feel like
yeah.
this? Did you ever feel the spirit, or did you ever like get
Yeah.
insight of like, wow, this is like something that I didn't get from Mormonism, and like, did you get insights from it where you felt like it gave you intuitive direction?
So some later things he wrote, I would say so. And I'll mention that in a minute. But these first writings, I mean, there wasn't anything that just all of a sudden gave me a great, insight. But I thought it was interesting that somebody could, I don't know if it's a type of channeling or automatic writing or, some type of inspiration to allow him to write all this.
Have you, short side tangent, have you listened to Infants on Thrones much? Do you know Glenn
Yeah,
Ostlund?
a lot. Yeah.
Have you
So I
listened
know.
to any of his Pleiadian channeling?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's interesting to me. I don't personally, really relate to it, but it
it's interesting
sounds
because,
kind of similar.
yeah, and I like the way so for people that are listening, I haven't listened to a lot of Infants on Thrones, but it was a pretty popular podcast. I think he's slowed down a bit. He's doing some other stuff. And it used to be a lot. It used to have John Hamer. I guess there used to be a lot
Yeah.
of them.
Right.
And I was listening to some recently, and I think it's a side channel, but he presents it as a creative exercise of like, hey, this is just creativity.
Mm-hmm.
Pleiadians are, so this is kind of like New Age mythology. So there's different star systems, and they all kind of have their own backstory. So like Orion, these are the place of duality. So those are the kind of the bad guys. But Pleiades and Sirius are these like more advanced people that have passed through like this transition place that we as Earth are going through. So Sirius, probably a connection to like Kolob there. Like there's a lot of similarities from my perspective. But yeah, so Pleiadians are, a lot of people connect with Pleiadians, and I think they're supposed to be like blue-skinned individuals or whatever. But yeah, so he does these channeling, just kind of these creative automatic writing, but it's speaking. His voice changes a bit. And I haven't explored or played around with any of this too much. I was doing like, I don't know if you're familiar with Akashic Records at all, but it's sort of the same. It's like a patriarchal blessings type of thing. And I was having somebody kind of teach me how to do that. But I think the first step with this is to just kind of let go and hold it loosely, and like not get too concerned of like, oh, is this coming from my head or is this like coming from somewhere out there? And like not take things too literally. And it takes, there's a process where you have to like let go and get into a flow state for channeling, automatic writing or whatnot. And I think it's very dependent on like, again, like like psychedelics or these other things, what you believe, your filters, whether you're Catholic or whether you're Christian or whatnot, it'll come through in those terms. And so I like, a lot of what he says is very, very scientific from what I've heard in terms of like how consciousness and neurons and whatnot. So even though he presents it as a kind of creative thing, I think there's a lot of actually sound insight in that. So I would imagine it'd be similar for these people that are creating scriptures like, hey, these are thoughts that are not coming from me. And then if they just keep honing it, they learn how to do it. And and sometimes they use props, whether it's, a stone, something to direct their single pointed attention. So it's interesting to hear that I would imagine it would have developed from first attempts to
I agree. It seems to be similar. Glenn Ostlund, by the way, he wrote a book called Bathing with God. That's another one I would look at.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard about it. I haven't read it.
Yeah. So John W. Bryant, he went through a bit of a transition where, the Church of Christ patriarchal that was really fundamentalist and, very literalistic, I guess, with their interpretation. They kind of transitioned a bit and moved to Las Vegas, where they had a ranch. One of their members, let them stay on their ranch as a commune, and is kind of like a hippie free love commune, in the 70s is what I picture. And they changed the name to the Evangelical Church of Christ, with patriarchal and evangelical kind of being synonymous, according to Joseph Smith. But more feminist, less patriarchal. And one of the things that happened is that he says that he met one of the wives of one of the three Nephites. Okay. And the wife of the three Nephite ordained him to the higher light of Christ through a sexual ordination. And then
This is like Tantra, basically.
yes.
Yeah.
And then he was given the charge to then pass that along to all of his followers. And so he implemented a system of sealings. You know, of course, there were sealings for eternity, but there were also sealings that could be for a month or even for one day, you know, and so um, that's kind of an interesting
Which is
concept.
funny because that's like what supposedly the BYU students were doing, you know, going
Yeah,
down to
exactly. Going to
Las Vegas. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you
Huh.
know, so after a while, the commune there fell apart. They couldn't pay their mortgage, and so they then moved to Salem, Oregon, um, and they changed the name again to the Church of the New Covenant in Christ. And it was there that he started learning about the Gnostic scriptures. Keep in mind, so the Nag Hammadi texts were translated into English in 1977. And so people like Hugh Nibley were writing about, you know, these Gnostic writings. And so he starts learning about it and starts incorporating Gnosticism into his teachings and beliefs. Um, Interestingly, he came to the conclusion that Joseph Smith was Gnostic, you know, that
Mhm.
Mormonism in the beginning was Gnosticism. And so
Yeah.
he
So, like a
viewed,
real, I guess, a quick side note,
yeah,
because this is super interesting. Um, It'll take me a bit to like figure this out. So basically, my my summary, and you can correct me if you have a different understanding. So Gnosticism, kind of a fraught term, but like describing what would be considered heretical, like various groups of Christianity, early Christianity that got basically killed off by Orthodox Christianity. Gnosticism, these groups, some did use psychedelics, others use different methods, but essentially the kind of commonalities were like a mystical or a gnosis, Gnosis, which is like deeper than knowing. It's like you you just know. It's deeper than our normal level of knowledge. So you have this merging with the divine, with God, with oneness, and you have this gnosis from that. Um, you know, there's a lot of like good stuff there. I think where I think they struggled, and I don't know how like literally they believe this or not, but the central tenets were that like the essentially there is kind of this oneness, the pleroma, and then like things were in balance, and then you had these lower emanations, eons of the oneness. So it's kind of like white light, but then you have these, you know, all the different colors that are like part of that. It's sort of like a fractal, and then I think depending on where you're at, the different, you know, there's different levels of development of this Gnostic, but something happened. There was an imbalance. The physical world was created by this demiurge, which is like the God of the Old Testament, Jehovah, Yahweh. So he's like this deranged middle manager that's out of balance. And he created the physical bodies, but then kind of this higher, more aligned Sophia breathed the spirits into these physical bodies so that they could have this like guiding light back to escape the matrix, essentially. And so God of religion of the Old Testament, Yahweh, is trying to keep us trapped here, but we are trying to get to so for them, like physical was bad, like the physical world was bad, which is sort of like, I mean, Joseph Smith was very Gnostic, but it's kind of, some of these things were flip-flop. But there's some interesting parallels, like there's Apocalypse of Adam. Have you read that at all?
um, I can't remember. I don't think so.
So I guess finishing the story of Gnosticism. So Gnostics were like killed off, their writings suppressed, and we didn't really know much about them until the Nag Hammadi texts. We didn't really know much about them except from the people that killed them off. But the Nag
Yeah,
Hammadi texts were found right after the Dead Sea Scrolls in Egypt, and they contained actual, like, first few centuries AD Gnostic texts. So one of those was the Apocalypse of Adam, and this is on BYU's website. I did some TikToks on it, but I'll have to do an episode combining those. But there's a lot of similarities. There's like Adam and Eve are in this kind of paradisical state, and they're serving this, like, Eve gives him this, Eve is joined with Adam. They're like one. And then there is this like demiurge that they fall out of this state. So like the fall, and then they forget that, like, there's this veil. And then these three messengers come to teach Adam about this. It was very similar to the temple endowment. And Joseph Smith wouldn't have known anything about these. And then they like know this new knowledge. And then God, the demiurge is like, hey, like, he's not happy with this. So he's trying to like enslave them. But Adam and Eve's kids keep waking up and like serving this higher God. Whereas the demiurge tries to like kill him with a flood and like Sodom and Gomorrah type stuff. So it's like the whole Bible, but flipped on its head. But there's a lot of very similar things there. So it's interesting that he evolved to Gnosticism.
right. So another Gnostic book is called The Hymn of the Pearl, and that's actually one that existed prior to the Nag Hammadi,
Okay.
discovery. So there's a possibility Joseph Smith may have known about it. It's part of a book called the Acts of Thomas. But the Hymn of the Pearl, it's more of a parable. It's pretty interesting. I'll just give you a summary of it. It's about a young man who leaves the palace where he grew up with, his dad is the king. And so his parents send him on a mission to Egypt to find and bring back the priceless pearl. And this pearl was being guarded by a serpent. And so he took off his robe. It's translated sometimes as a robe of glory. Sometimes it's translated as a glorious garment. And he takes that off. He goes on his journey. He gets to Egypt, and then he kind of assimilates with the Egyptians. He eats their food. He wears their clothes. He kind of forgets about his mission, and he falls asleep spiritually. And then his parents and his older brother, as well as the council of leaders, from his home, they write a letter and send the letter with the messenger. And he reads the letter, and all of a sudden he remembers his mission, and he charms the serpent. He gets the pearl. He goes back, and before he enters the palace, he puts on his glorious garment, and then everything ends
Mm.
with a happy ending. So
It's
that's
really,
kind of an interesting parable.
it's interesting because, I've had some really like insights of like, oh, I think I actually get like the fall, the Adam and Eve myth, especially from this Apocalypse of Adam. Adam and Eve are one in this higher state of consciousness. And then, and then they fall from this state of consciousness and they kind of forget that world. They forget the garden. And that's when like the demiurge appears, but that gnosis or that divine potential goes kind of latent into their seed. And then, the three messengers from the top, the true God kind of wake them up. And then they tell them this knowledge Adam tells Eve this knowledge, and then they tell Seth about this. And so it's Seth's descendants that are the ones that are following this God. Whereas, like, it's funny because the people that follow the demiurge, they keep losing battles to Seth's descendants, and they're kind of pissed off because they're like, why are we, they're talking to their God, like, why are we losing battles to these people? They don't follow your, they're talking to the demiurge, like, they don't follow your rules. And then they have sort of a, there's kind of a Christ-like figure in it. And then eventually the people that follow the demiurge recognize that, like, you guys are following the true order, true God. And, but I realized that Adam and Eve, like, this is a parable about consciousness, like oneness, these states of consciousness and the veil. And I think in the Gospel of Thomas, which is an apocryphal text, the creation story, Adam was androgynous. You know, it wasn't male or female. And that was like the true state of a higher state of perfection. And then it split into duality. So I realized that the fall, I think there's a few different things, like the knowledge of good and evil, like the fruit of the tree of good and evil. I don't think it's not a knowledge. It was like the curse of judging things as black and white, good and evil, labeling things. Similarly, like they're naming all the animals. And that's how we develop, of like, we are stuck into constructs of, like, you know, I'm a self and this is a couch and this is, you know, we're separate, as well as, yeah, like the fall also corresponded with shame and guilt and this nakedness and Satan saying, like, hey, you're naked, you got to cover up. And then, yeah, you get out of the garden, Christ, I think this is what the endowment was trying to show, like, Christ, the atonement wasn't like paying for the sins, but, Christ represented this reconciliation, achieving God consciousness again, having this mystical union, and then returning back to the garden, returning back to Zion, going through the duality. It's not that we shouldn't have never left the garden, we shouldn't have eaten that fruit. That's one thing where Mormonism and Gnosticism do parallel, is like, oh no, the fall was a good thing. It was our step of our evolution. And it's that we go into duality and then we actually learn how to integrate that back into this oneness. And so your story is very similar to that. It's like you have this knowledge and then you come down here, you have a veil put on you, you forget your mission, and then something wakes you up and you remember. And a lot of people talk about this in their spiritual awakening. And my fiance, I view it as like, I learned these things, but she's like, I never learned these things. Like, I just remembered. And a lot of people are talking about, yeah, you remember, kind of the veil is lifted. And it's interesting that the serpent is a symbol of Kundalini, the divine feminine, Shakti. And so, yeah, the endowment is so weird because a lot of it is Gnostic. Like, even Satan says, like, I'm the God of this world, which if you take that literally, that means like Jehovah, Yahweh in the Old Testament. Like, maybe we've been reading the book from the wrong. Yeah. Like we've just been reading the history that was written by the wrong side. So I'll have to look that up and read that.
Yeah. It seems like Gnosticism, it's focused on discovering the true higher God, discovering your true, and the way to do that is by looking within yourself, and finding the God within yourself. It talks a lot about everyone has a divine spark, and that we're in this material world that was created by this evil demiurge, and we need to kind of break out of the materialism and find that spiritual, enlightenment. So, that it's some interesting concepts there.
Have you
so obviously go ahead.
Have you read the Apocalypse of James? Or if you've listened to my episodes, you've heard me talk about the Apocalypse of James. That's pretty interesting too, in that, it's supposedly Jesus telling James, the brother of Jesus, I don't know, like, hey, you're going to die, you're going to be crucified, like, and then you're going to come to these archons, which are kind of like demon, bad
That's what,
angels, kind of
yeah,
people trying to keep us
exactly.
trapped here. I think they're going to ask you questions. You're going to have these answers to get out to the highest level of heaven. And like, here are the specific questions and answers. But the text doesn't, they don't have all the text. But it's so similar to the temple endowment. And again, this was in the non-commodity text. So Joseph Smith wouldn't have had this. So it's interesting that, and I think there's a path for a lot of people that like they get into this esoteric stuff, like they get into Hunibili and they realize like, I'm not getting like, I want the meat. I'm not getting that from the church. And they start diving into these things. And at first it's like, oh my gosh, this really supports Mormonism. Like there is something there. He wouldn't have known this otherwise. But then the further you go, I think you realize like, oh, like Mormonism is just kind of another Gnostic sect, which I think has a lot of insights that mainstream Christianity doesn't have, but it goes from like, you're fitting all this truth into Mormonism to like, oh, like maybe like the things that we in Mormonism taught about all these other churches of like, oh yeah, Taoism could have been enlightened and there, Muhammad could have been, had
Mhm.
some truth. Like God speaks to people in the truth that they're able to have. Maybe that also applied to like Joseph Smith and Mormonism. Like maybe they're all in the same thing.
I agree with you. That makes sense. Um, just to kind of finish the story of John W. Bryant, he then moved from Oregon to San Diego and changed the name of his church to the Church of the Pearl. And then just a few years ago, it was changed again to the Gnostic Temple of the Pearl. And so attended several of their online services. Very nice people, very interesting. The way their services work, they sing hymns for half an hour first, and they have their own hymns written by one of their members, um, kind of an Eastern style music with acoustic guitar. And then they have a sermon and a discussion, and then they have meditation time and yoga time,
Hmm.
and then what they call icon time. And so that's drawing pictures, and it's kind of allowing your unconscious to come out, in the form of
Wow.
art. So it's kind of interesting.
Like theologically, what do they think about God and what do they think about Satan?
Well, so what? Um, I do know this. They're very they take things symbolically, figuratively. Everything is myth. So he went from being fundamentalist, literalist, polygamist to
Wow.
now, a liberal theologically, where he even says that his old scriptures were, he takes them figuratively now,
Mm.
so he still believes that he was inspired, but not that it was literal. Another interesting thing he's done is he's done an inspired version, or his own
Mm-hmm.
translation of several of the Nag Hammadi texts, and
Mm.
he renamed them. Like for example, the Hymn of the Pearl, he renamed it "In Quest of the Priceless Pearl."
Hmm.
And for example, the Gospel of the Egyptians, he renamed it "The Book of the Great Invisible Light." And so it's kind of like Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible. He took these Gnostic scriptures and then he kind of incorporated Mormonism into it. Um,
Wow.
so, so to this day, they use the Book of Mormon. They call it the Book of More Good. going off of
Uh-huh.
Joseph Smith said, Mormon means more good, but they
It's
kind of downplay their Mormon origins. They don't really talk about it too much. Um, Another
that,
interesting thing, they have their sacrament service once a month on the new moon. So
okay.
not on Sundays, but it's in the evening. And actually, it's two services, two nights in a row. And so the first service, they use bread and wine for their sacrament, and the next night they use fruit and ale. And so it's kind of
Hmm.
interesting.
What's interesting for me, like, I think this is a really beautiful story. I don't know. Are you familiar with like stages of development? And there's
Yeah.
different, yeah. So like that's what this looks like. And a couple of days ago, I was talking to somebody on the Latter Day Lobsters. There's a Jordan Peterson Mormon
Okay.
Facebook group. There's this pretty good group of like open-minded people. I'm not a big Jordan Peterson, like I haven't listened to much of his stuff. He's into Jung, and so I think
Yeah. I
some of it
like
would
him.
overlap. But he seems to be a little more kind of like the Jordan or the entrance to this from like a more conservative or like a religious
Okay.
perspective. Whereas I had to come from, as a more liberal, not religious perspective. And so a lot of good discussion there. I had made a joke the other day of how do we know God is a Mormon? Because the plan of salvation is a multi-level marketing scheme. And somebody was like, this explains polygamy. And I was like, that's true. Like you're getting more downlines. Cause it's instead of currency, it's, you know, the progression of souls. And so like, that's what you're trying to maximize. That's how you exalt your God and whatnot. And so I had a discussion with somebody that was doing, I guess, a lot of really fascinating work with like CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy and DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, and attachment with fundamentalist groups of women of how to have healthier polygamous marriages and teaching, which I think was really fascinating. So we were talking about polyamory, and she was saying, she said she feels like more, she was an advocate for it. And she was saying that, Mormonism is going to go through a sexual awakening, a sexual revolution. And she's talking about, they're going to go through these different stages of like apathy and then something else. And it really got me thinking about Joseph Smith, and that I think he was trying to go through these stages of development, not very healthily, I think, but I think you definitely see his theology changing from like the Book of Mormon, more Christian God and
Yeah.
Jesus, to like very, very esoteric stuff. And in my awakening and through a lot of people's awakening, like, and in Jung's individuation process, you end up having to do all these things that you shut down, all these parts of yourself that you had to shut down to be accepted by society, to be by your family, to be kept safe. So it can be pretty messy and pretty ungrounded. And so I've often wondered like what it would have looked like if he if he would have lived in a time, one, if he wouldn't have had his childhood trauma with those surgeries, and losing Alvin, because I think those are really crucial things in his like psychological development. And two, if he would have lived in a time where he could have like told Emma like, hey, I want to open up the marriage, and she could have said like, no, like we're done. I don't need you. Like I can take the kids, or like, sure, but if he wouldn't have had to have put it through this context of religion, and where he would have gone, because like he was only 33, or how old was he when he died?
38, I
38,
think.
38.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's only 38. So like that was bizarre for me to realize that, like, I mean, like I'm older than Joseph Smith, and how much he did. And I have a fraught relationship with him. Like, you know, I understand a lot of, I think, what he went through and have a lot of compassion for him. You know, I just have to think of like my 7-year-old kid going through unanesthetized surgery, being held down by your dad. On the other hand, like I think there's so many harmful things that were done in polygamy with the Danites, you know, with everything.
Yeah.
But it would have been interesting to see how he would have evolved, how Mormonism would have evolved if they wouldn't have lost him, because I think Brigham Young he just couldn't carry on that esoteric. And you could tell that Joseph Smith was trying to, like in King Follett's discourse, like that's a really tortured man there, saying like, you know, I never harmed anybody. Like there are a lot of narcissistic traits there, but you can tell that he like is trying to do good, but he also knows what he's done. And he also knows that like people are looking for his life. And so it's interesting to see like some group that has evolved and like been able to say like, I got to explore this, and like, oh, maybe I did that kind of messy, because that's how like my awakening was. Like I was pretty ungrounded. I did, you know, some messy things. And a lot of people, when they leave Mormonism, like, yeah, you know, they have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, and, you know, they jump into polyamory and they usually don't stay there, but they have to figure things out. So in some ways I feel like Joseph Smith today, I was thinking he's kind of like the first ex-Mormon to like just kind of jump ship and try to evolve.
Yeah, that one of the reasons I enjoy learning about these other groups, these other prophets, you know, is to maybe give a glimpse of, you know, what Joseph was experiencing, you know, and I still don't fully understand, but I waver back and forth between, you know, what was he a fraud? Was he sincere? Was he, you know, trying to help people? And I think it's a little bit of all of the above. You know, I think at the beginning, you know, he was a fraudulent treasure seeker, but he was trying to earn money. You know, he was in poverty, trying to help his family. Probably rationalized it in that way. And then I think he came up with the idea of writing a book, you know, as a way to make money. Um, you know, we always say Samuel Smith, his brother, was the first missionary, but I view him as a bookseller. You know, he packed up books that, you know, did you know Joseph Smith Sr. was a book peddler for a while? You know, he made his living part of the time selling books. So, you know, the book didn't sell so well, and so he decided to form a religion around it, and that provided for his needs. You know, he eventually had a mansion built for himself, the mansion house in Nauvoo. So,
and I think even with like the treasure seeking in the Book of Mormon, I think there's indication with those that he did believe those, because I mean, there's accounts of like, I think his dad waking everybody up because they like the spirit was telling him about some treasure somewhere, and they got to draw the circle and whatnot. Like, really, I mean, I think it is important to look at these kind of really simplistic claims of like, who's just this narcissistic fraud that wanted to, you know, other people's wives. Like, well, that wouldn't really. Some of these things don't check out of like why. I think his family really believed these things too. Believe that there were these treasures, and even with like the Book of Mormon, I think when he went to get the plates the one year, they had to, I think the instructions were to like go in all black or something, and there's like a receipt for you know, like getting something to paint the carriage black or something. So like, I think the key component to this, and from my experiences kind of helped make sense, is that when you have just utterly bizarre mystical experiences that like bend reality and that are realer than real, like a lot of these near-death experiences and psychedelic experiences and mystical experiences. One of the common things is like, no, that was realer than real life. Like real life is a dream. This is even realer. So like when we talk about, these things as hallucinations, I think they really don't do justice to how real they are. And it doesn't incorporate any real knowledge of how our brain and consciousness and perception work. And so when people are having these experiences, and you see this with like the alien abductees and the UFO encounters and stuff, like these people aren't doing it for the fame or whatnot, and they're traumatized by it. So that they believe in these things. And then I think one thing that goes on, and I never saw anything like that. I had these mystical experiences of like visually everything becoming like so much more beautiful for like, like 720p to like 8K resolution and more colorful and everything, not like meditating or anything. I'd never experienced it before. So it's very bizarre and it's hard to integrate. And you see all these like synchronicities of even kind of psychic things. And like, you don't have any way to explain it. So I think you're faced with this, like, I am crazy or I'm a prophet of God. Right. And you don't know which to believe. You really hope it's not the crazy thing. And so you like, okay, like this is the better option. And then you really, you go back and forth. And the more people call you crazy, the more you have to double down on like, no, like I saw what I saw. And then I think a lot of what happened is just not having like a container and people to help integrate it. Like for me, I was lucky enough to have a friend that knew about Kundalini awakenings and psychedelics, which even though mine didn't involve substances, he knew like how to introduce me to things and help me ground. But it's very much a knife edge. And if I wouldn't have had that, I think it could have been very unhealthy. And so I think that's the key. So like, I think he could have even believed that the Nephites and the Lamanites were real and maybe even like quote unquote saw plates. But at some point probably had to realize, oh, they're not in this dimension. And maybe I need some props to get other people to buy in. But I think he believed a lot of what he believed, but that's hard for people to wrap their head around of like how that could be possible.
And he probably rationalized, what he was doing by the fact that it was bringing people closer to God, to Christ. As the Book of Mormon says, if it brings you closer to Christ, it's from God. And so he said, it seems to me like he was rationalizing it in his mind that what he was doing was from God because it was bringing people closer. You mentioned making props, that brought to mind, I went to Palmyra and, outside of the Joseph Smith home, they have a cooper shop where, even to this day, there's sheets of tin and tin snips in there where they made, used the tin to make the barrels, I thought, could have been that he used that tin to make a set of plates. Who knows?
Yeah, there's I read King Follett Discourse recently. It's a pretty amazing, profound, interesting doctrine, but like just a look into his psyche. And the line where he's like, I don't blame anybody for not believing me. Like I wouldn't have believed it myself if I wouldn't have gone through it. Like I really resonate with that. And I can see like how it's so interesting reading his stuff and reading Lucy Mack and like having like learned a lot about psychology and attachment and like done a lot of work and like recognized things in people and why people do the things they do. You can tell, that there was a lot of unhealed stuff in that family and that it's like, he's railing against lawyers and the other priests, and like there's good guys and there's bad guys, and there's no real often recontextualization of like how these bad people are also part of, you know, God's children and whatnot. It's like these are like the people that are trying to, that have called him crazy, that are trying to take his life. It's a lot of splitting. Do you see, so the happiness letter, I'm curious, in these different Gnostic sects that you've gone through, like how much do you see themes of that popping up? This idea, like sometimes you need to do the wrong things to, like, you know, God tells us things that we think are wrong.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't seen it in any of the other groups I've looked at, but boy, I've heard that quote so many times, you know, growing up that now I can't even quote it offhand. But
Happiness is like the desire, or
the design of our existence, and
Mm.
but then you realize what the background of where that letter came from. You know, trying to convince a young woman to marry him. You know, stating that you may think that this is wrong, but if God is telling me to do it, then it's right. You know?
Yeah.
It's
Have you
definitely manipulation there.
have you heard of Knights of the Crystal Blade?
Yeah.
Okay, I
So
served my mission with John Coltharp, and I guess
yeah.
Samuel Schaefer was also on the Montana mission, but I didn't meet him.
So exactly. So Samuel Schaefer actually he joined the Church of the Pearl with John W. Bryant for a period of
Okay,
time. First, so he left the LDS Church. He joined a guy named Leland Freeborn. It's called the Kingdom of God, and he's
so
in
this is
Parowan,
Samuel.
Utah. So no, so Samuel became a follower of this Parowan prophet, Leland
Okay,
Freeborn. And Leland Freeborn had been a follower of John W. Bryant. He was actually the president of the Quorum of 12 for him. And but then Samuel Schaefer left Leland Freeborn. He joined with John W. Bryant, and then he started his own church called the Church of the Diamond. And then he merged with another guy named Mark Lichtenwalter. And then after that, he formed the Knights of the Crystal Blade.
so for people
Yeah.
listening, yeah. So Samuel Schaefer, I guess, would be maybe a year or two older than me. He ends up going with this John Coltharp guy. They're both in jail now. Okay, so take us from there with the
Well, yeah.
story.
So they basically they kidnapped their own children from
This
their
was with
ex-wives.
John Coltharp.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they married each other's 8-year-old daughters while they were hiding in southern Utah, living in a storage container.
Mm-hmm.
And so sad stuff there, but yeah, they were finally caught and arrested. And but that's
Have you?
so they didn't focus so much on the Gnosticism, it didn't seem like, but definitely, you know, receiving revelations, you know, God told me to do this, and so
So I've
forth.
tried to find some more information about it. So yeah, my side of the story was I served with John Coltharp on my mission in Montana Billings, and he I liked him. He was a nice guy. He was very, very into deep doctrine. He gave me like a 20, 30, 40 page Adam God
Okay.
thing. Okay. Oh, yeah. Real quick. So the Adam God thing, this is what my insight is like. Oh, like Adam is God. He's the only God that we have to worry about because Adam represents in his paradisical glory, like the God mind. So that finally like clicked of like, I think this is what Brigham Young was trying to tap into. But yeah, so he was into this Adam God stuff. He gave me like a stack of paper of all these quotes about Adam
Mhm.
God. We told John, we're like, you're either going to be an apostle or an apostate
Yeah.
while we're on the mission with him. And then I didn't hear until maybe 5-7 years ago or something. Somebody texted me like, hey, do you see this news about John? there was a really fascinating article that I read, though, that was talking a bit about the backstory, where I forget, one of them had some experience where they were looking at a flame growing up, and they saw the flame do different things. So they had some sort of psychedelic or mystical experience. I think the difficulty with this is when somebody takes psychedelics or a substance and they have these experiences, they can think like, oh yeah, that's just tricking my brain. While mine wasn't like so much a psychedelic experience, it was a mind bending, reality bending thing. There wasn't anything that I could look back and say like, oh yeah, I took something an hour ago. Mine was triggered by just this like complete upheaval of divorce and job stress and getting into psychology and meditation and just like everything, breaking open, like a lot of pain and suffering. So it's a lot harder from my experience when you don't have anything to blame it on. Because the only way that we contextualize these things in Western culture is you're crazy, or it's God, or it's a substance. So he had one of them had that experience with the flame. And then there was another really bizarre, I can find the article, but they were talking about a bunch of guys together. This was before they did the cult. They were really into Dungeons and Dragons, and they were really into exploring consciousness. And I don't know if there were substances involved or not, but the article talks about one of them saying, some really weird stuff happened. Like one time, the one guy said that he could like control reality, and he had us gather up all the dice in the house, and he like rolled like 10 dice, and they were all snake eyes. So there's some weird synchronicities, but like group synchronicities, which it's easy again to like have one person having something weird and say, oh, they're schizophrenic or psychosis or whatnot. But you do have these accounts of groups of people experiencing things. You got near-death experiences, and then you have like shared death experiences where somebody in the same room has a mystical experience because the person there is dying, or they're not even in the same location. So there's other things that science can't, they don't, it's not easily explained by like kind of our materialistic kind of hallucinations thing. So there was that, which was very interesting. But then I guess there was some point where they had, started the cult or early days. And I think Samuel had like looked into the fire and saw something, had it happen again. And then he looked at John and he was like, did you see that? And I don't think John saw it, but he was like, he knew what was happening or something. He's like, we have to figure out why these things are happening to us. Like we must have a mission. And so I think that's really indicative of what happens with these groups, and they can end up more healthfully, like I think Denver Snuffer, where they can end up very badly. And I think it depends on how that person can integrate it, how other people can help them through that, how much trauma they have. So I stumbled across a YouTube video that has a lot of footage and background information. It was put out like a month or two about the Knights of the Crystal Blade. So that was talking about that they were in a lot of like Norse mythology, and they were into different gods and stuff. So I think there was some Gnostic stuff involved there, but I haven't looked to see if I could get a hold of any of their like scriptures or whatnot. But it's really fascinating to see. They interviewed those parents, and the parents were like, they didn't know whether we should believe it or not, but like he told us he was being contacted by these spirits, and so it's very sad what happened there. But I think it is informative of like how these things develop and how we as a society can help prevent that from going that direction.
Very true. Very true.
Any other sects that...
I'll mention one other. So there's a guy named Archie Wood, and he started what's called the True Gnostic Church. And so Archie Wood, he is a Vietnam War vet. While he was recovering from injuries, he, was introduced to the LDS Church, converted, and then after a number of years, he basically had a faith crisis and decided to leave the church. He went to the top of a mountain and prayed, and he says that he was visited by Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother, and he then spent 20 years writing his book of scripture, and I actually have it right here. It's 800 pages, called The Song of God, and it's quite a book. I can't say I've read it all, but he lived in the mountains, basically, as a hermit. But he wrote this out by hand, and I'll just kind of mention that the first part of it is called Beginnings, and it's kind of like a version of Genesis, and then the second book is called Yeshua, and it's kind of like his version of the New Testament, although he took out all the supernatural aspects of it, kind of like the Jefferson Bible, So interestingly, he has these visions, he has these supernatural experiences, but yet he's very grounded in reason and science and evolution, So he doesn't believe Jesus was resurrected, but yet he has these encounters with God. And then there's the Book of Wisdom, which is where he talks about his basically revelations given to him about his life. And then the Book of Enlightenment, which is about Gnosticism. So
the plot twist in this, though, is that
yes,
God is us from the future, right?
yes. So then, and just to mention this, there's the Book of Pearls, which is kind of like Psalms. Interesting that he's involved in pearls, kind of like the Gnostic Temple of the Pearl. But then there are 7 books referred to as endowments. Okay, now these endowments it's a storyline, it's a narrative of basically people from the future, like 5,000 years in the future, who become gods. They evolve into God, and then they travel back in time to the beginning of time. And so we today are actually descendants of these evolved gods. So,
So I've read some of this stuff, not much, but
yeah,
there's actually like a fairly like decent amount of like reason and some like scientific stuff that makes sense here. So like even that idea of like recycling, like this is a cosmological idea of like the circular universe, is that like the Big Bang happens and then there's kind of like a heat death sort of thing, but it's actually like if enough time happens just by chance, it condenses back in and then it just goes again and again. And so it's interesting because like I think even some of his stuff like does sort of line up with some quantum physics. What I find, I think, difficult with these, or where they kind of not go wrong, but where things don't add up, is they do take time and space as like fundamental. Whereas like, I think if you really go deep enough, and that's why I don't know if you watched Donald Hoffman's stuff, but time and space and like on the edges of physics are really showing that it's just kind of they're kind of a construct that we've made up that is useful in processing the information of the world. And so like, that's my view of consciousness, that like, it's all one, but there's all these different kind of ways that you can view this infinite amount of information. And time is sort of just the illusion of like, okay, it's like a database where
yeah.
you're just querying it. And you're like, I'm going to run a SQL query and like try to get this information out of it. And then you're like, oh, I want to change it a little bit to get this. And you kind of like keep doing queries. That's what your life is. That's what your experience is like just taking the whole infinite thing. And you're like taking query after query after query. And like, that's how we kind of progress through it. That's the illusion of time. And we're actually not, we've identified with the query, but we're actually like, are they actually the database? We're the person doing the queries. So I think I haven't, there's so many things I'd like to read. I'd like to read more of his stuff, but a lot of these people do end up kind of re-deriving some of these things. And there is, as much as it kind of triggers skeptical people, people that are really stuck on materialism, like there is a lot of overlap between Eastern philosophy and quantum physics, because they're just kind of two ways of looking at these same philosophical principles. So, but then like tell us a little bit more about him and where he ended up.
Well, so he had a number of followers, enough to support him financially, but he actually ended up leaving his followers, and he went back to be with his family. So he stopped stopped being a prophet. Someone else kind of took over for him. His name is Court Bramwell. So they have an online presence, but they're not really a functioning church.
Yeah, and Court actually reached out to me, and we chatted a bit. And he's like, actually, like he's not leading it, but it's interesting because from my impression, he's like, I saw kind of the two sides of this person. Like I saw something was going on, but then I also saw kind of this really unhealed, kind of narcissistic, like, there were two sides, one that seemed really inspired and guided. And that's what like kind of drew me to exploring this. But I also saw this other side that was there too. Yeah. And I think he sees that there's something there. He doesn't have like a definitive, that he was a prophet or that like this, but he's like, I think this should be preserved out there. But yeah, so he found the podcast through Bill Reel, and I think he's putting it there to preserve it. I've got to circle back to him. We've talked about maybe, discussing, trying to get him on here. And I think that's like a good approach, is that we gravitate to the extremes, like to the Lori Vallow, to the Chad Daybell, to the, right, to the easier things to say, oh, they're crazy, or that they were just hallucinating, or the dichotomies of like, Joseph Smith was this prophet of God that, look, yeah, he could make mistakes, but only as long as the church still is the same, like the true church from there on. Or he's this fraud that just wanted to con people out of money. But there's so many other in-between options. And there's other people that you can look at that are a lot harder to pigeonhole like that. And there's a lot of other channeled works that I think are a lot better than the Book of Mormon, where like the person was a lot less wounded and they just produced, like, I don't know, the Course in Miracles was that psychologist that was an atheist that had an entity that identified as Jesus talking to her. And she's like, okay, I'm going to write this down. And there's a lot of people that find a lot of wisdom in that book. And that's a lot more in line, I think, with Eastern philosophy and non-duality. So, but I think it's easy for us to like try to make sense of the world. And we just focus on the easy to classify cases of like, this is a fraud, just trying to deceive people. And I think what you've done is like, you show that there's lots in between, and there's people that evolve from like these conservative patriarchal things to like kind of going through the stage of like sexual liberation to like feminism. And it's interesting that one of the common themes is God and like Heavenly Mother. And you see like the traumas of, I think, of Mormonism. I view Mormonism as kind of this egregore, this collective consciousness that has this trauma of like a wounded father that needs to feel like they're important, needs to have power, and like, yes, says that the mother is important too, but the decisions are his, and the mother takes a step back and we don't talk about her.
Yeah.
And this sexual repression that, this really hyper focus. I think Joseph Smith's, my opinion, like his early childhood follies, I think were just normal, probably sexual development, and that kind of started this ball rolling. So it's interesting to like kind of see what Mormonism has picked up and kind of carried, like this inability to apologize of things. It's just, oh, this is just continued revelation rather than, oh, yeah, we kind of screwed up there.
Gabe, you're real interesting to listen to about this. You seem to have a good understanding of putting this all together.
Yeah, it's funny because I walked away without any like firm conclusions, and then and kind of like left Jesus and the Bible and Mormonism. And then when I like unbelieved everything, then I felt like I was open enough to actually understand truth. And then I could go back and now look at all those things and be like, oh, these are actually really meaningful things in the Bible. And then I can see all the other stuff that was probably just misinterpreted, or like things in Mormonism that I was able to appreciate the good parts of it. So, well, thanks so much. I guess what's your takeaway of studying these different groups? And maybe some other time we'll talk about the fundamentalist groups. And
Well, it seems like we're all a combination of good and bad. We're all a combination of, sincere, but also a part of us is maybe fraudulent. We all have masks. We don't show everything to everyone. So, I think these prophets are regular people like the rest of us, but maybe they're tapping into some kind of collective unconscious or some kind, you know, tapping into the universe in some way. I don't know, but I guess I used to think that they were all crazy and frauds, and now I'm a little more on the side that they're probably for the most part sincere. I guess pious fraud is probably a good term to use.
what I guess the last question I have is, tell me, what was leaving FAIR like leaving the apologetic community, and your response from other people that you worked with, as well as, when I would see people leave, there was this like deep sadness. But looking back, I kind of recognized that it was me wondering like, oh, are these people doing something that I would never have the courage to do? It's kind of like being, I don't know, one of those games where like once you get the joke, you leave the room or something, and then you feel like you're one of the last people. So I don't know, what was that experience like?
I'm someone who hates confrontation, so I just quietly ended, and I didn't tell anybody why. And I will say I wasn't one of the most involved people in FAIR, so there. I don't know. Probably most people didn't even notice that I was missing, but I decided to just not try to blow things up on my way out.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a number of people who cycle through, and they either get burned out with apologetics or they leave the church, and it's kind of a stopping point on the way to apostasy, I think, for a lot of people. But it's been a good journey. I can't complain. It's my life is good. I enjoy life. I enjoy learning about religion and spirituality and history and science. And to me, I feel like I have a much clearer understanding than I ever did before. even though I'm
Yeah,
not always articulate in explaining it. But
well, I think it's interesting and like beautiful that like I have this passion, as you can see, and connect a lot of things, but I have so many interests that it's nice to come together with somebody that has like done like work in a silo like you've had, like reading all these things. And I think that's where that's where the beauty is like when you have people that are like in the silos and then people that are like putting things together, and then you're integrating, because nobody themselves is going to be able to explore all these different things and then like read all these different things and go to these different groups. It's really the collection of it all together. What's your do you have a goal? Or I mean, you've presented a few times at these different historical, like what's your plans
yeah,
for the
I have
future in terms
more.
of
My niche, my interest is just the small, lesser known, Mormon groups and prophets and so forth. And so um, I'm hoping to speak at the next John Whitmer conference, which will be in St. George. And so I'm going to talk about prophets in, southern Utah, prophets. There's one guy in particular named Alex Joseph, who's quite a character. So anyway,
I've seen I've seen Stephen Pinecker with
yes,
Mormon Book Reviews has had some people on, and I've thought about, I don't know, as I like do maybe less Mormon stuff, maybe I won't, but I've been curious to reach out and see if some of these people that are like creating scriptures would come on, and I'd be curious to see. Yeah, I mean, because from my perspective, it's similar to yours. Is that like, I can. What I've learned is like every perspective is valid just based on the fact that somebody has that perspective. People's experiences are valid because I've experienced both sides I've experienced 30 some years of like a very normal, non-mystical or magical life. And then I experienced some years of like, that's different reality. Like I live in a different reality now. Things have settled down, but like, it's a lot more synchronicities than before. And so I think everybody's perspective is valid, but you don't have to, their interpretations and the way they integrate it into things like that, you don't have to agree on. But I think that's the key, is to like try to understand somebody's position, be like, oh, you had these experiences, this is your interpretation of it, and like try to inhabit that rather than telling them where they're wrong. So I may, if you find any that are interesting and you want to send them my way, maybe I'll end up reaching out at some point or reading some of these scriptures. So,
okay.
yeah, thank you so much for coming on, and keep filling root canals. You're an endodontist, right?
I am, yeah. So we're
Yeah,
both dentists.
yeah. I was thinking today. I was like, that's my least favorite part. I've come to enjoy a lot of dentistry, and I think I would enjoy it too if I like had got a system that I was familiar with and had, if we did enough. But yeah, I'll still be happy sending them your way.
I'm one of the weird people. I love doing root canals.
When you've got the rubber dam on though, and like when you've got a system, it is sort of meditative where you just like, you're just doing your thing. You just focus on one little thing. You don't have a whole mouth to focus on. So I can appreciate it. I just haven't gotten to the level where I choose to do them. Well, thanks for coming on, Mike. We'll keep in touch.
Okay. I'll talk to you
Have a good one.
later. Okay, you too.
Bye.